Okay, so we've been talking about the classical period in ancient Greece, and we're going to continue that discussion today. Specifically, we're going to look at sculpture during the late classical period, and we're really going to focus on three great sculptors from this period, and that's Praxiteles, Scopas, and Lysippus. Okay, so one of the things to kind of introduce us to what's happening in the late classical period is just sort of checking in historically about what's going on. So the Peloponnesian War is happening. Athens gets absolutely crushed by Sparta. And if you're thinking, wait, why are Sparta and Athens fighting after the Delian League and everybody being allied? Remember when I was talking about the Acropolis and about how Athens kind of stole all the money essentially from that was supposed to be for a defense fund and invested it in just creating the Acropolis in Athens? Some of the other Greek city-states were not very happy about that. So there was infighting, which is the Peloponnesian Wars. So Sparta and Athens are fighting. Athens gets completely crushed by Sparta. Sparta is very good at fighting. And then Thebes comes in and takes everything over. Then the Greeks are like, oh no, the Persians are coming again. We need to all get back together and work together. And they try to kind of realign together, and it doesn't work very well, and they lose. Okay, so Greek city-states and just Greece kind of as a whole is in a pretty weakened state at this point. What happens when formerly great empires are in weakened states? Well, usually someone comes in and takes everything over, and that's exactly what happens now. So, in the weakened state, the Macedonian king comes in and takes everything over. That guy's name is Philip II. So you see Macedonia up there, and he takes over basically what's Greece. Again, it's not totally unified as one country yet, but he comes in and takes everything over. And he is succeeded by someone who you may have heard of. Okay, so let's look at this map really quick. You'll notice that all of the red is what the Macedonian Empire becomes under Philip II. So he takes over all of this large area. You'll notice Sparta is not conquered. Very good at fighting, not good people to irritate. So unconquered Greek territory, the only little place is Sparta, and up there kind of in the northeast. And then there's the allied people who are not, Macedonia doesn't take them over, but they're allied with Macedonia. Okay, so Philip II dies in 336 BC, and he is succeeded by his son, who is much more famous than him. At this point in the seated class, I would ask people to kind of guess who they think his son might be, if you know anything about history from this time. He is succeeded by Alexander the Great. You've maybe heard of Alexander the Great. He's a very famous guy. He's a very famous leader, very famous conqueror. And his name is actually Alexander III. So Alex comes in, he overthrows the Persians and follows them back to their home turf and defeats them there as well and conquers Persia. So instead of just kicking them out of Greece, he has a decisive victory over them at Issus, which you can see there on the map. He then continues conquering things. He goes down to Egypt and conquers Egypt. So that's where we have Alexandria, where the great library is that's named after him that burns. That's something you may have heard of historically. And he goes all the way into the east, through the Middle East, all the way over to India, and conquers all of this as he goes. So this is a huge territory. He's now hugely expanded his father's territory to the east and makes this gigantic empire. Okay? So during all of this upheaval, the Greeks shift focus from the perfect and ideal. Remember Polycletos's canon and this idea of the perfect ideal ratios of the human body, and how to pursue that in terms of visual aesthetics. So they kind of shift from that idea of perfection, and they start looking at individuals and looking at the real world and being more interested in depicting what people actually look like instead of creating this ideal kind of standard. They're like, we actually want to portray individualized people and prove that as artists, we are able to capture something very realistically based on individuals, not just this set of essentially math rules to make everything look perfect or idealized. Okay, so the first of the three great sculptors from this period that we're going to look at is Praxiteles. And so he's around in the 4th century BC. And this is one of his most famous works. One of you is assigned one of his other works in the discussion, which is his sculpture of Hermes and Dionysus. So we'll look at this one. This is probably his most famous work. So this is called Aphrodite of Needles. So the story of this specific sculpture is it is commissioned by a town. And in my seated class, one of the first things that I do when I show them this is say, what do you notice about this right off the bat that is different from other sculptures we've looked at in ancient Greece? And the answer is she's naked. So we've seen lots of male nude sculptures, but it is not something that we've seen with women being portrayed in sculpture in ancient Greece. They tend to be clothed. So this is kind of a shocking thing that he does. But he's very interested in this idea of portraying the real human form and looking at real human anatomy. And he doesn't really understand this idea that men can be portrayed nude but women can't. So he confronts this straight on, and he creates this work. So the town that originally commissioned it rejects it. They don't want it. They're like, no, we can't have a naked lady around. That's not cool. That's against the rules. Seeing an opportunity, the city of Knidos says, we'll buy it from you. So they buy this and they display it publicly in the city center. And it's a huge tourist draw. People come from all over to see this, which is kind of like today. Whenever there's controversy, there's kind of some buzz about something if there's controversy. So it's the same kind of thing in ancient times. People by word of mouth hear about this very scandalous naked lady sculpture and come from all over to Knidos to see it. People fall in love with this sculpture. They're so taken by its beauty. And in several of the accounts of it, people from the time who are writing talk about how he was such a skilled sculptor, he was able to make the marble look like real human flesh, like look like a real person. And so people are just kind of blown away by this. So this also has a big impact in sculpture as a whole. Because this idea of looking at what people look like and trying to mimic what you actually see in nature from a real human model in front of you instead of using these ratios. So when you're portraying a god or goddess and you're using a human model, it has a humanizing effect, right? So we're portraying this goddess, Aphrodite, who should be immortal and perfect and all of this, as an actual human woman. So it means the gods and goddesses start taking on this kind of worldliness, this sort of humanized role. Praxiteles also is very good at conveying kind of a sensuousness, okay, and really making the marble look like sensuous human flesh. So also look at her pose. She's in contrapposto stance, which we have talked about, and she's standing very much in a way that is a more natural pose than some of these previous really stiff poses that we've seen. She also, her body seems fairly soft, so most of the nude work that we've seen so far, of course, has been men, and it's been men with very athletic, muscular bodies. So this is a study in anatomy that isn't so much focusing on just this muscular, athletic type build, but just kind of like, here's a sensuous, like, nude woman. So it's a very different kind of examination. So it's humanizing of the gods. We get this feeling of flesh and sensuousness. It's still beautiful, but it's not perfect. It looks more flawed and human and real. Up to this point, women, even goddesses, were never rendered nude. So this kind of breaks through that taboo, and other artists feel emboldened to also create nude works featuring women. Again, it's controversial, and it makes it quite famous, this controversy. So it becomes a very popular, very well-regarded sculpture. Okay, the original is lost to time. We only have Roman copies of this, which is true from a lot of things during this time. So the other thing we see at this point in sculpture is the emergence of individual styles of artists. So you can kind of pick out a Praxiteles in this particular style that he does. So he has this kind of sensuous, dreamy quality is what he's sort of known for. Okay, let's look at the second major master sculptor from this time period. That is Scopas. Scopas is known for his intense emotionalism. He was also an architect. He created the tomb of Mausolus, which is where we get the phrase mausoleum. One of you is assigned that in the discussion, so we'll learn more about that in the discussion. As an example of his work, I wanted to show you this. So these are a couple of Roman copies of his original work, which was bronze, because it's been lost to time. So one of the things that's interesting here is because we have multiple copies of this, we can see slight variations in the copies, which is sort of interesting. This particular character, Meleager, is a character who was the host of this mythic boar hunt, the Caledonian boar hunt, which was kind of this, like, not exactly coming of age, but like proving of your hero status kind of thing in mythology. It's one of the great adventure legends. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, who's also the goddess of the moon, sends the boar, and the goal is for the hunters participating to kill it, to be the first one to draw blood from the boar or to kill it, and it's kind of proving your manliness. In the story of Meleager, Atalanta, who is a woman, wins this famous boar hunt by being the first to wound it with an arrow. So it's this kind of interesting subject matter. Anyway, let's look at the sculpture itself. So, like Praxiteles, we can see that this is someone who's interested in portraying the human anatomy and the human body, and he's not using Polykleidos's exact canon and ratios. He's working from a model and depicting them as they actually appear. Still in very good shape, very athletic kind of build, but you can see it's in the contrapposto stance. It's a more naturalized portrayal of a person. Also, in a lot of his sculptures, the facial expressions are extremely emotional. So we see very intense emotions on the facial expressions. Okay, the last of the three sculptors that we're going to talk about from this time period is Lysippus. Alexander the Great commissioned him for his official portrait. So he's kind of a big deal when you get like the leader, the great conqueror, Alex the Great, to commission a portrait from you. You're pretty famous. And he, like Scopas and Praxiteles, is interested in changing these rules about the official canon that we get from Polykleidos, but he more formally challenges it. So they just kind of do their own thing and are like, we're not going to follow your rules, we're going to do this instead. He actually kind of introduces a new list of proportions that he thinks make more sense. And one of them is just that, as Polykleidos said, that the human head is generally about 1/7 of the overall body height. Well, in Lysippus's version of these ratios, he says the head is actually 1/8 of the body. Okay, so he kind of changes that particular ratio, which impacts how everything is portrayed. And so he has a couple of different famous sculptures. One of you is going to look at Apoxiomenos, I believe, in the discussion. But we're going to look at this one of Heracles. So there are a couple of things about this sculpture that I think are super interesting. One of them is just look at this person. Look at the way Heracles is depicted. Very different than the bodies of the other athletes and male sculptures that we've seen so far. He's kind of bulky, right? He's very muscular. And that's one of the things that Lysippus is interested in. He's interested in portraying the human anatomy and looking at the kind of extreme musculature that can be developed by these heroes and athletes and people. So we see a much bulkier human proportion than we've seen so far, and just a real interest in musculature and how it works. And you can see that this is an exaggerated contrapposto stance. He's actually leaning on something to the side. So we have a more exaggerated stance. You'll notice the details. We have his club there, which is something that Heracles is portrayed with pretty often. We also have the Nemean lion hide, which I talked to you about earlier when we were looking at the Temple of Zeus. This is one of the things from his 12 labors, so we often see him with a lion hide. The other thing that's really interesting about Lysippus that he's sort of known for is he's very interested in this idea of sculpture in the round, right? So we've looked at lots of relief sculpture where it's very three-dimensional sculpture, but it's attached to a pediment or attached in some way to a temple. So because he's doing standalone sculpture in the round that could be like out in the middle of a room, he really wants to get the viewer to walk all the way around it. So up until this point, even three-dimensional standalone sculpture like this has kind of been over off to the side, kind of engaged with the wall. And he intentionally confronts this idea and wants to really lean into the three-dimensionality of these sculptures. And so he'll often create these little kind of like Easter eggs, these little kind of hidden things. So if you walk all the way around the sculpture, you're able to see them. So in this case, we have Heracles is holding these 3 apples behind his back, which is a reference to another one of his 12 labors, right? So we looked at another sculpture that was showing him with his apples. So it's kind of a neat thing because it encourages the viewer to really take in the whole sculpture and walk all the way around it. He's a pretty famous sculptor. As I said, he did Alexander the Great's official portrait. And he's also pretty influential to later artists when we get to the Renaissance period, which isn't in this class, but when you take art history 2 with me, Michelangelo is very influenced by Lysippus. You can see this in Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel. All the like writhing muscular bodies is very influenced by this type of work. Okay, so next we're going to look at the Macedonian court of Alexander the Great and the artists who were in his employ.